I'm Ethan, 24 years old, and for nearly 3 months my entire family believed I stole my younger brother's college fund. Not just suspected it, not just wondered, believed it. My mother called me a disgrace. My father told relatives I had betrayed the family. My aunt sent me a message saying she hoped I got professional help before I ruined more lives. The worst part? Nobody ever asked for proof. The moment the money disappeared, everyone already knew who the villain was supposed to be. Me. And honestly, I shouldn't have been surprised. Because in my family, my brother Jake had always been the golden child. Jake could do no wrong. If he got a C in school, it was because the teacher was unfair. If I got an A-, my parents wanted to know what happened to the missing points. Jake got praised for potential. I got judged on results. That was the system we'd lived under for years. I was used to it. What I wasn't prepared for was becoming the target of a crime I didn't commit. The nightmare started on a Sunday afternoon. My phone rang while I was cleaning my apartment. The second I answered, my mother's voice exploded through the speaker. "Ethan, what did you do?" I actually pulled the phone away from my ear. "What? Don't play stupid with me." My stomach tightened. Whenever Mom used that tone, something bad was coming. "What happened?" "The college account." "What college account?" "Jake's college fund." I stared at the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about." There was a pause. Then she said something that changed everything. "The money is gone." Gone. Nearly $80,000. Vanished. I genuinely thought there had to be some mistake, but then my father got on the phone. His voice was colder than my mother's. "The bank says someone transferred the funds." "Okay." "They used family access credentials." I frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" Silence. Then my father answered, "Stop lying." And suddenly I understood. They thought I did it. Not Jake, not a hacker, not an administrative error. Me, their first suspect. Their only suspect. That realization hurt more than the accusation itself, because innocent people don't immediately worry about proving themselves. They worry about why the people who supposedly love them assumed the worst. And I already knew the answer. I was the expendable child. Jake was the favorite. The story practically wrote itself. Jake needed college money. Money disappeared. Therefore, Ethan stole it. Case closed. The next day, I drove to my parents' house hoping to clear things up. Instead, I walked into what felt like an intervention. Mom, Dad, Jake, 2 aunts, 1 uncle, everybody sitting in the living room, waiting for me like I was a criminal arriving for questioning. Jake looked especially convincing. Red eyes, sad expression. Victim mode activated. I remember staring at him and thinking something felt off, not wrong exactly. Just rehearsed like he was acting. Mom immediately started crying. "How could you do this to your brother?" And that was the moment I realized nobody there intended to listen. They'd already reached a verdict. This wasn't a discussion. This was sentencing. And as I sat down in that room, surrounded by my own family, I had no idea the person who had stolen the money was sitting only 6 feet away from me, looking me directly in the eye, and pretending to be the victim. I sat in my parents' living room feeling like I had somehow walked into a trial without knowing the charges beforehand. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody asked whether I had any explanation. Nobody even asked if I needed to see the evidence. They simply assumed I was guilty. Jake sat on the couch beside Mom with his head lowered, looking like a devastated victim whose future had just been stolen. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't known him my entire life, I probably would have believed it too. Dad folded his arms. "Do you have anything to say?" I stared at him. "Yeah. I didn't take the money." Mom immediately shook her head. "Ethan, please don't make this harder." Harder? I hadn't even been allowed to defend myself yet. "What proof do you have that I took it?" The room went quiet. That should have been my first clue, because nobody answered, not immediately. Eventually, Dad cleared his throat. "The bank said someone used family credentials. Lots of people had access." "No," Dad pointed at me. "You had access." I laughed, not because anything was funny, because the accusation was ridiculous. "Jake had access too." The room instantly became uncomfortable. Nobody liked that answer, especially Jake. He looked up for the first time. "Why would I steal my own college fund?" There it was, the question that seemed impossible to argue against. Everyone nodded. Mom actually looked relieved, like Jake had delivered the perfect rebuttal, and maybe he had. At least on the surface. Because who steals their own education savings? Who empties an account intended for tuition? Who destroys their own future? Apparently nobody in that room thought the answer could be Jake. Not even for a second. I tried another angle. "Did the bank tell you where the money went?" Dad frowned. "They're investigating. So you don't know?" "No." "Then how do you know I took it?" That question irritated him. I could see it. People hate when you point out holes in a story they've already decided to believe. "We know enough." No, they didn't. They just preferred a version of events that fit the family narrative. The responsible son had betrayed everyone. The favorite son had been victimized. Simple, convenient, comfortable. The conversation got worse from there. My Aunt Linda started talking about trust. My uncle started talking about family loyalty. Mom cried. Dad lectured. and somehow I spent the next hour defending myself against an accusation nobody could actually prove. By the time I left, I felt exhausted, but something else bothered me. Jake barely spoke. For someone whose entire future had supposedly disappeared overnight, he seemed strangely calm. Sad, yes, angry, not really, panicked, not even close, that didn't make sense. If I lost $80,000 tomorrow, I'd be losing my mind. Jake looked like someone acting upset because he knew he was supposed to. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Family members stopped calling. Cousins stopped responding to texts. One relative removed me from a family group chat. Another sent me a Bible verse about honesty. Apparently word had spread, and in the retelling the story had become even uglier. I wasn't merely accused anymore. I was guilty. Everyone talked about the theft as if it had already been proven. My reputation disappeared almost overnight. Meanwhile, Jake continued receiving sympathy from everyone. Relatives offered support. Friends encouraged him. My parents constantly checked on him. Nobody checked on me, not once. Then came the first crack in the story. About a month later, I ran into one of Jake's friends at a grocery store. We weren't close, but we knew each other. He recognized me immediately. His smile faded. Hey, awkward silence. Then he said something strange. How's your brother's car? I frowned. What car? His face immediately changed. The kind of expression people make when they realize they've said something they shouldn't. Nothing, no, what car? He hesitated. Aren't you guys talking? My stomach dropped. What car? Another pause, then he finally answered. The Mustang. I felt my heartbeat accelerate. Jake didn't own a Mustang. At least not officially, and nobody had mentioned buying one. Jake bought a Mustang? The friend looked nervous. I thought you knew. I didn't, not even a little, and suddenly dozens of small details started connecting inside my head. Jake's calm behavior, the lack of panic, his strangely rehearsed sadness, the fact that nobody knew where the money had gone, the fact that he never seemed worried about college. I drove home with a knot in my stomach. Something was wrong, very wrong. That night I started digging. Social media, old posts, tagged photos, anything I could find. At first there wasn't much. Then around midnight I found it, a picture posted by one of Jake's friends. The photo had been uploaded only a few days after the college fund disappeared. Several guys standing beside a dark blue Mustang. Expensive, new, definitely not cheap. And standing right in the center was Jake, smiling, not grieving. Not devastated, not worried about his future, smiling. The caption was simple, big moves. I stared at that picture for nearly 10 minutes, then I zoomed in. Then I zoomed in again, and that's when I noticed something sitting on the windshield. Temporary registration paperwork, meaning the car had been purchased recently, very recently. Around the same time, $80,000 mysteriously vanished. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something besides anger. Hope, because maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe my instincts had been right all along. Maybe the victim sitting in my parents' living room wasn't actually a victim. Maybe he was the thief. And if that was true, I was about to uncover a secret that would destroy the entire story my family had built around me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photo, Jake standing beside the Mustang, smiling, celebrating, acting like someone who had just won the lottery, not someone whose college future had supposedly been destroyed. The next morning, I opened the picture again. Then I looked at the upload date. 3 days after the college fund disappeared. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe it wasn't his car. Maybe one of his friends owned it. Maybe I was becoming paranoid after weeks of being blamed for something I didn't do. I wanted to believe that. But deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. After work, I decided to drive through Jake's neighborhood. Not because I had a plan, I just needed answers. My brother lived in a small apartment complex about 20 minutes from my place. As I pulled into the parking lot, I immediately spotted it. Dark blue, Mustang GT, parked directly outside Jake's building. I sat there staring at it. The thing looked expensive, very expensive. Not something a 19-year-old college student working part-time could casually afford. I checked my phone, then checked the car, then checked the photo. Same vehicle, same custom wheels, same small scratch near the rear bumper. There was no doubt anymore. The Mustang belonged to Jake. My chest tightened. I suddenly understood why he hadn't seemed worried, because he knew exactly where the money had gone. I stayed in the parking lot for another 10 minutes before finally leaving. At this point, I had evidence that Jake had purchased an expensive car shortly after the college fund vanished. But that wasn't enough. Not for my parents. Not for the rest of the family. If I accused Jake based on a photograph and a car, they'd call me jealous, desperate, vindictive. I needed something stronger, something undeniable. For the next week, I quietly started paying attention. And the more I watched, the worse things looked. Jake wasn't just driving a new Mustang. He was spending money everywhere. Expensive restaurants, designer clothes, weekend trips, concert tickets, bar tabs. Things that didn't match the lifestyle of a broke college student. The weirdest part? He wasn't even trying to hide it. His social media was full of it. Photos, videos, stories. Every week seemed more extravagant than the last. It was like watching someone burn cash as fast as possible. Then another clue appeared. One evening I received a call from an unfamiliar number. Normally I would have ignored it. For some reason I answered. "Hello?" The voice sounded hesitant. "Ethan, yes. This is Tyler." I recognized the name immediately. One of Jake's friends, not his closest friend, but close enough. "What do you need?" There was a long pause, then Tyler sighed. "I think you should know something." My heart immediately started racing. "What?" "Jake's been telling everyone you stole the money." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I know. No, I mean everyone." Tyler sounded uncomfortable. "He's been saying it for weeks." That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was what came next. "There's something else." I waited. Tyler lowered his voice. "I think Jake has gambling debts." For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. "What? He started betting online last year." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How much?" "I don't know exactly. But it got bad." I sat down. Suddenly everything felt heavier. "How bad?" Tyler sighed. "Really bad." Over the next 20 minutes Tyler told me things I never would have believed about my brother. Sports betting, online casinos, poker apps, constant losses, borrowing money from friends, borrowing money from classmates, borrowing money from practically anyone willing to lend it. Apparently Jake had spent nearly a year chasing losses. Every time he lost, he'd bet more trying to recover. Every time he lost again, he'd double down. The cycle kept getting worse. Eventually people stopped lending him money, and according to Tyler, Jake became desperate, very desperate. When the call ended, I sat in silence, because suddenly everything made sense. The missing money, the expensive car, the lack of panic, the performance in my parents' living room, all of it. But one question remained. If Jake was drowning in debt, why buy a Mustang? The answer came 2 days later, pure accident. I was scrolling through social media when another photo appeared. This time it wasn't from Jake. It was from a local dealership, a customer spotlight post. And there he was, Jake, standing beside the Mustang. The caption congratulated him on his purchase. But what caught my attention wasn't the car. It was the financing information. The dealership proudly mentioned that Jake had made an unusually large cash down payment. Cash, not a loan. Not financing, cash. My stomach dropped. That meant he hadn't spent all the money on the vehicle. He'd only used part of it, which raised an even bigger question. Where was the rest? $80,000 minus the car still left a huge amount unaccounted for. And somehow I knew the answer wouldn't be good. A week later, I finally got it. Tyler called again. This time he sounded nervous. "Ethan, what happened? You didn't hear this from me." "Hear what?" Another pause. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Jake lost almost 40 grand gambling." I froze. "What? Before the college fund disappeared?" The room suddenly felt smaller. $40,000, gone, lost. And according to Tyler, the losses had happened over several months. Jake had borrowed money from multiple people trying to recover. Every attempt only made things worse. Then the college fund vanished. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. For the first time, I could see the entire picture. Jake had gotten himself buried in debt. The walls were closing in. People wanted repayment. His lies were catching up with him, and then he remembered something. The college account. A massive pool of money. Money he technically had access to. Money nobody expected him to steal. Because who steals their own college fund? The answer was simple. Someone desperate enough. Someone addicted enough. Someone reckless enough. Someone like Jake. But even with all these pieces, I still lacked one thing. Proof. Real proof. The kind that could survive scrutiny. The kind that could force my parents to finally face reality. And I had no idea that proof was already on its way. Because within days, someone was going to show up at my door carrying information that would completely destroy Jake's carefully constructed lie. 3 days after my second conversation with Tyler, somebody knocked on my apartment door at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I wasn't expecting anyone. At first, I assumed it was a delivery driver who had the wrong address. I opened the door without thinking. A man I'd never seen before stood outside. Mid-30s, tired eyes, wrinkled shirt. The expression of someone who had spent the entire day dealing with problems. He looked past me into the apartment. "Jake," I frowned. "No," the man blinked. "This isn't Jake Miller's place?" "No," he looked frustrated. "Sorry," he started turning away before suddenly stopping. "Wait," I instantly felt uneasy. "What? You know Jake?" I hesitated. "He's my brother." The man's expression changed immediately. Almost like he'd accidentally found exactly who he was looking for. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed heavily. "Can I ask you something?" I shouldn't have said yes, but curiosity got the better of me. "What is it?" The man rubbed his forehead. "Has your brother paid you back yet?" My heart skipped. "Paid me back for what?" The man laughed bitterly. "Guess that's a no." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "What are you talking about?" The man introduced himself as Chris, and over the next 15 minutes he told me a story that made my blood run cold. Chris wasn't a debt collector. He wasn't a bank employee, he wasn't a lawyer. He was simply another person Jake had borrowed money from. $5,000. Gone. Jake promised repayment within a month. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, every excuse imaginable had appeared. Family emergency, job problems, bank issues, delayed payments, lost debit cards. Chris had heard them all, and recently Jake stopped answering completely. So why are you looking for him? Chris laughed. Because I'm tired of being lied to. Fair enough. Then he said something that changed everything. I know where your brother got the money. I froze. What? Chris looked around before lowering his voice. He told me. For a moment I couldn't speak. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter. What did he tell you? Chris shook his head. Honestly, I don't think he meant to. I waited. He got drunk. Of course he did. Chris continued. A few months ago he was celebrating. Celebrating, not grieving, not struggling, celebrating. The exact opposite of what he'd shown our family. What did he say? Chris looked uncomfortable. That he'd solved all his problems. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. He said he found a way out. I could barely breathe. What way? Chris looked directly at me. Then he delivered the sentence I'd been waiting weeks to hear. He said he emptied the college account before anyone could stop him. Silence. Absolute silence. I just stared at him. Because after months of accusations, rumors, and family judgment, someone had finally said the words out loud. Jake did it. Not me. Jake. Chris reached into a folder he was carrying. I wasn't planning to show anyone this. My hands suddenly felt shaky. What is it? He handed me several printed screenshots. Messages, text messages, dozens of them between him and Jake. At first glance, most looked normal. Requests for extensions, promises to repay, excuses. Then I reached one specific message, and everything changed. The message had been sent late at night, apparently after Jake had been drinking. It read, "Relax, I'll have money soon. I already took care of the college fund situation." I stared at those words, again, and again, and again. My brother had literally put it in writing, not a confession exactly, but close enough. Close enough that any reasonable person would start asking questions. I looked up. Chris nodded. There's more. My pulse quickened. More. He handed me another screenshot, then another, each one worse than the last. One message referenced moving money, another referenced keeping his parents distracted, a third referenced making sure nobody checked certain transactions. None of them directly said, "I stole the money." But together, the picture was devastating. And then came the final blow. Chris opened his folder again. This time he removed a photocopy of something that looked official. What is this? Casino withdrawal receipt. I stared. The amount nearly made me drop the paper. $22,000. Withdrawn over a series of transactions, within weeks of the missing college fund. My heart sank. The money wasn't just gone, it had been burned, destroyed, thrown into gambling, exactly as Tyler suspected. I suddenly felt sick. Not because of the money, because of my parents. Because while they'd spent months treating me like a criminal, their precious golden child had been destroying his own future, and covering it up by sacrificing mine. Chris eventually left, but not before giving me copies of everything, every screenshot, every receipt, every message, every piece of evidence. When the door finally closed, I sat alone at my kitchen table for nearly an hour. The papers spread out in front of me. The truth was finally visible. Clear, obvious, undeniable, and yet I already knew what was going to happen. My parents wouldn't believe it, not immediately. Because accepting the truth meant accepting something far worse than a stolen college fund. It meant admitting they'd spent months attacking the wrong son. It meant admitting they'd chosen Jake over me yet again. It meant admitting their favorite child had lied to them. People don't give up those beliefs easily, especially parents. But whether they wanted to believe it or not didn't matter anymore. Because I wasn't the frightened son begging to be trusted. I wasn't the family scapegoat desperately defending himself. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had evidence. Real evidence. And I was finally ready to use it. What I didn't know was that Jake was already panicking, because somebody else had started asking questions. Questions he couldn't answer. Questions that were about to bring his entire lie crashing down. And when that happened, the family meeting that followed would become the most explosive confrontation of our lives. The family meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon. Ironically, it was held in the exact same living room where I'd been accused 3 months earlier. The same couch, the same chairs, the same people, but this time I wasn't walking in terrified. I wasn't walking in desperate for someone to believe me. I was walking in with evidence, and that changed everything. Mom had no idea why I'd requested the meeting. Dad sounded annoyed when I called. My aunts assumed I wanted to apologize. Even Jake seemed relaxed. That was the funniest part. He actually thought he was safe. When I arrived, everyone was already there. Mom gave me a cautious smile. Dad sat with his arms crossed. Jake lounged comfortably in a chair, scrolling through his phone, the picture of confidence, the picture of innocence, the picture of a man who had absolutely no idea his world was about to collapse. Dad spoke first. "You wanted to talk?" I nodded. "Yes." Then I placed a thick folder on the coffee table. Immediately, everyone looked at it. Jake's expression changed slightly, only slightly, but I noticed the first crack. "What is that?" Mom asked. "Evidence." The room fell silent. Dad frowned. "Evidence of what?" I looked directly at Jake. "The truth." For the first time all afternoon, Jake sat up. Not much, just enough. But I noticed that too. His confidence had started slipping. I opened the folder. "Before we start, I want everyone here to remember something." Nobody spoke. I continued. "For 3 months, I've been called a thief." Mom looked uncomfortable. "I know." "No." I raised my hand. "Please let me finish." The room became quiet again. "For 3 months, nobody asked whether I was innocent." I looked around the room. Nobody wanted proof. Nobody met my eyes. Everyone just assumed I did it. My aunt looked down. My uncle shifted uncomfortably. Dad's jaw tightened. And Jake looked nervous, very nervous. I pulled out the first photograph, the Mustang, then I placed it on the table. Mom frowned. "What is this?" "A car." Dad looked confused. "So," I turned toward Jake. "Want to tell them when you bought it?" His face immediately lost color, not all of it, but enough. "What does that have to do with anything?" There it was, the first defensive answer. I smiled. "A lot." Nobody understood yet, but they would. I slid another document across the table, the dealership photo, the purchase date, the financing information, the cash down payment. Dad picked it up first. His eyes narrowed, then widened. "What is this?" I answered calmly. "The Mustang was purchased 3 days after the college fund disappeared." The room went silent. Jake swallowed. Mom looked at him, then back at me, then back at him again. The first doubt had appeared. Finally, Jake immediately laughed, a forced laugh, a bad laugh. "I saved money." I almost felt embarrassed for him. Even he didn't sound convinced. "Really?" I asked. "Yes." "From where?" No answer. The silence stretched. Mom looked confused. Dad looked suspicious. Jake looked trapped. I wasn't finished, not even close. I pulled out the screenshots from Chris, the text messages. One by one, I spread them across the coffee table. The room became so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. Dad grabbed the first page, then another, then another. As he read, his face slowly changed. Confusion, concern, shock, then anger, real anger, the kind I hadn't seen from him in years. "What is this?" Nobody answered, because everybody already knew. The messages spoke for themselves. Mom took one of the screenshots. Her hand actually trembled. I watched her read the message. "Relax, I'll have money soon. I already took care of the college fund situation." The color drained from her face. Jake immediately jumped in. "That's not what it means." Panic, for the first time actual panic. I leaned back. "Then what does it mean?" No answer. Jake opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out because there wasn't a good explanation. There never had been. The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier. Everyone was beginning to realize the same thing. The story they'd believed for months was falling apart, fast. Then Dad stood up, slowly, dangerously slowly. "Jake," my brother looked terrified. "Yes." Dad held up the screenshots. "Did you take the money?" The question hung in the air. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody looked away. Jake stared at the floor, then at Mom, then at Dad, then at me. His eyes were searching desperately for an escape route. A lie, an excuse, anything, but there wasn't one, not anymore, and everyone knew it. Still, he tried. "I can explain." The worst possible answer. "Because innocent people don't say that. Innocent people say no." Dad's face hardened. "Then explain." Jake started talking. The problem was that every sentence contradicted the last. First, he claimed he borrowed money. Then he claimed the car belonged to a friend. Then he claimed the screenshots were misunderstood. Then he claimed he couldn't remember. Every explanation made things worse, not better. The room slowly turned against him. My aunt stopped defending him. My uncle stopped defending him. Even Mom looked uncertain now. The golden child armor was cracking, and underneath it was exactly what I'd expected. A scared liar. Then came the moment everything changed. Dad looked directly at Jake and asked one simple question. "Did you gamble?" The room froze. Jake froze. And in that single second, everyone got their answer, because he didn't deny it. He couldn't. The silence was louder than any confession. Mom looked horrified. Dad looked furious. I felt something strange, not satisfaction, not happiness. Relief, because for the first time in months I wasn't the one on trial anymore. Jake was, and he was losing badly. But none of us realized how much worse it was about to get. Because the college fund wasn't the only money he'd stolen. Not even close. And the next confession would reveal a secret so devastating that it would leave my mother in tears and my father questioning everything he thought he knew about his favorite son. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Dad asked the gambling question. The silence felt suffocating. Jake sat frozen in his chair, staring at the floor. And honestly, that silence told everyone more than any answer could have. Because if the accusation had been false, he would have denied it immediately. Instead, he looked like a man trying to calculate how much of the truth he could reveal without completely destroying himself. Unfortunately for him, that option no longer existed. Dad's voice became colder. "Answer me." Jake swallowed. His hands were shaking now, slightly, but enough for everyone to notice. "Yes." Mom looked like she'd been slapped. The room instantly became heavier. Yes, what? Dad asked. Jake's voice cracked. I gambled. The words hit the room like a bomb. My aunt covered her mouth. My uncle stared at him. Mom simply blinked. Like her brain was refusing to process what she'd heard. For years, Jake had been the responsible one in her eyes, the smart one, the talented one, the son who could do no wrong, and now that image was collapsing right in front of her. Dad sat down slowly. His face was unreadable. That scared me more than if he'd started yelling, because quiet anger from my father was always worse. How much? Jake hesitated. Jake, about 20,000. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I knew it was a lie, and judging by Dad's expression, he knew too. Try again. Jake looked trapped. His breathing became heavier. Finally, he whispered, 40. Mom gasped, actually gasped. Like all the air had suddenly left her body. $40,000, gone, not invested, not stolen by a hacker, not lost because of fraud, gambled away. I watched my mother's face, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I saw something new. Not disappointment, not confusion, guilt, because she was starting to understand exactly what had happened, and more importantly, who she'd blamed. Dad leaned forward. When? Jake didn't answer. When? A few months. The answer somehow made everything worse. This hadn't been one bad decision. This wasn't a single mistake. It had been happening for months. Months of lies, months of deception. Months of pretending everything was fine while digging himself deeper into a hole. Then Dad asked the question everyone was thinking. The college fund? Jake closed his eyes. I knew what was coming. Everybody did. But hearing it was still different. Did you take it? For several seconds, Jake said nothing. Then finally, yes. Mom started crying immediately, not loud crying, the quiet kind. The kind that comes when reality finally catches up with you. The kind that hurts. My brother had stolen his own college fund, just like I'd suspected, just like the evidence suggested, just like nobody had wanted to believe. And he'd let me take the blame for it, for months. Dad's face looked almost gray. Why? Jake laughed bitterly, not because he thought anything was funny, because he had run out of excuses. I needed money. No, Dad shook his head. Why didn't you tell us? That question hit harder because there was an answer, a simple one. Jake finally looked up, and for the first time all day he told the truth. Because I knew you'd be disappointed. The room fell silent again. Mom looked heartbroken, Dad looked exhausted, and suddenly I understood something. Jake hadn't stolen the money because he was evil. He stole it because he'd spent years living as the golden child, the perfect son, the favorite, the one everyone expected to succeed. And eventually he became terrified of failing, so instead of admitting his problems, he hid them, then lied about them, then stole to cover them, then lied again, until the lies became too big to manage. But while I could understand it, I couldn't forgive it. Not after what he'd done to me. Then Dad asked another question. Is there anything else? The second those words left his mouth, Jake looked away. And my stomach dropped, because guilty people only react like that when the answer is yes. Dad noticed too. His voice became dangerously calm. Jake, no response. Is there anything else? Mom stopped crying. Everyone stared. And slowly, painfully, Jake nodded. My chest tightened. There was more, much more. Then he said something nobody expected. I borrowed from Mom. Mom frowned. What? Jake wouldn't look at her. I took money from your account. The room exploded. What? Mom actually stood up. The shock on her face was unlike anything I'd ever seen. How much? Jake looked sick. 7,000. Mom's eyes filled with tears again. Not because of the money, because of the betrayal, because this wasn't some anonymous college account. This was her personal savings. Money she'd spent years building. Money she'd trusted him around, and he'd taken it. Dad looked furious. When? Jake whispered. Last year. The room spun into chaos. Questions, accusations, arguments, everyone talking at once, but I barely heard any of it, because I was watching my mother's face. Watching realization slowly spread across it. Not just about Jake. About me. She was remembering every accusation, every phone call, every insult. Every moment she chose his side without evidence. And for the first time she looked ashamed. Truly ashamed. Eventually the room became quiet again. Nobody knew what to say. The truth was finally out, or at least most of it. The golden child wasn't a victim. The thief wasn't me. The family story everyone believed was a lie. And now they had to live with that. But the biggest consequences were still ahead, because confessions are one thing, forgiveness is another. And over the next few weeks, my family would discover that repairing the damage Jake caused was far more difficult than uncovering the truth. Especially when they realized I wasn't interested in pretending none of this happened. For months, they abandoned me. Now they wanted things to go back to normal. They were about to learn that wasn't possible, not anymore. The fallout started almost immediately. Within 24 hours of the family meeting, the entire family knew the truth. Not the version Jake had told, not the version my parents had believed. The actual truth. Jake had stolen the college fund. Jake had gambled away tens of thousands of dollars. Jake had borrowed money from friends. Jake had taken money from Mom's savings. And perhaps worst of all, Jake had allowed me to take the blame for months while he watched from the sidelines. For once, nobody was calling me, they were calling him. And suddenly the silence I'd endured for 3 months became his problem. The first call came from Mom. I almost didn't answer. After everything that happened, part of me wanted to let it ring forever. But eventually I picked up. Her voice sounded exhausted, not angry, not defensive, just tired. "Ethan." I didn't say anything. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she started crying. Again. "I'm sorry." The words surprised me, not because I hadn't wanted them, because I'd stopped expecting them. "I should have listened." I stared out my apartment window. The city lights blurred slightly. "I know." More crying. "I was wrong." I closed my eyes. Part of me felt relieved, part of me felt angry, part of me felt absolutely nothing, because apologies are strange things. When you've been hurt long enough, you sometimes imagine they'll magically fix everything. But when they finally arrive, you realize they can't. They explain the wound. They don't erase it. Mom kept talking. "I should have trusted you. Yes, I failed you." The honesty caught me off guard. For the first time in my life, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't shifting blame. She was admitting what she'd done. And somehow that made it hurt even more. Because now there was no argument left. Only truth. The call lasted almost an hour, mostly her apologizing, mostly me listening. When it ended, I felt emotionally drained. But the next call was harder. Dad. My father wasn't the apologizing type. Never had been. Growing up, he believed actions mattered more than words. So when his name appeared on my phone, I honestly didn't know what to expect. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but I'll remember it for the rest of my life. "Ethan." "Yeah." Long pause, then, "I was wrong." No excuses, no explanations, no defenses, just those 3 words. And somehow they carried more weight than an entire speech. My father continued. "I should have stood up for you." I swallowed, hard, because that was the part that hurt the most. Not that strangers believed the accusation. Not that distant relatives judged me. My father, the person who was supposed to protect me, hadn't. He joined them, and he knew it. "I'm sorry." Another silence. Then he added something that genuinely shocked me. "I'm ashamed of myself." I didn't know how to respond, because I'd never heard my father say anything like that before, not once. The call ended shortly afterward, but the emotional damage remained. Over the following week, apologies arrived from everywhere. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. People who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly remembered my phone number. Some apologized sincerely. Others sounded more concerned about fixing family drama than admitting wrongdoing. I could tell the difference. And honestly, I didn't have much patience left. One cousin sent a 3-paragraph message explaining how she'd been misled. I deleted it. Another claimed everyone had simply been worried. I ignored it because worry wasn't what happened. They hadn't worried, they judged. There's a difference. Meanwhile, Jake became a ghost. Nobody talked about him much. Nobody defended him anymore. Nobody rushed to protect him. The golden child's shield had shattered. And suddenly he was experiencing something I knew very well, consequences. A week after the meeting, Mom invited me over for dinner. Just me. No Jake. No relatives, no audience. I almost declined. Eventually, I agreed. The house felt different, quieter, smaller somehow. When I walked into the kitchen, Mom hugged me immediately. And for the first time in months, I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to hug her back. Part of me remembered every accusation, every phone call, every time she'd chosen Jake over me. The dinner was awkward, painfully awkward. We talked about work, the weather, random family updates, anything except the giant emotional crater sitting between us. Eventually, Dad set down his fork. "We need to talk." Mom nodded. I knew where this was heading. Dad looked uncomfortable, something that almost never happened. "We spent years treating you differently." The statement hung in the air. Nobody interrupted, because everyone knew it was true. Dad sighed. "I don't think we realized how obvious it was." I laughed, not happily, just tired. "It was pretty obvious." Mom looked down. "I know." The conversation lasted for hours. For the first time ever, we discussed things we'd avoided for years. The favoritism, the double standards, the excuses, the expectations, all of it. And as painful as it was, something important happened. My parents stopped talking about Jake's mistakes and started talking about their own. That mattered, because this wasn't only about the stolen money. The money had simply exposed a problem that already existed. The real issue was that they'd spent years assuming Jake deserved trust while I had to earn it. The theft just proved how dangerous that mindset could become. As the evening ended, Mom walked me to my car. Before I got in, she stopped me. "Ethan." I turned around. She looked like she wanted to say 100 things. Instead, she asked one question. "Can you ever forgive us?" The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. Because forgiveness isn't a switch. You don't flip it on because someone apologized. Trust takes years to build, minutes to destroy, and a very long time to rebuild. So I gave her the only honest answer I had. "I don't know." Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded, because deep down she understood. For months I'd been fighting to prove my innocence. Now my family was fighting to earn back my trust, and that process was only beginning. Meanwhile, Jake was facing consequences nobody could protect him from, because the people he owed money to weren't interested in family forgiveness. They wanted repayment. And as his financial disaster spiraled further out of control, he was about to discover that losing the family's trust was only the beginning of his problems. For most of his life, Jake had never really experienced consequences. That wasn't entirely his fault. When you're the favorite child, people tend to soften the impact of your mistakes. They explain them away. They defend you. They rescue you. They convince themselves and you that things aren't as bad as they actually are. For years, that had been Jake's reality. If he forgot an obligation, someone covered for him. If he made a bad decision, someone fixed it. If he created a problem, someone else absorbed the damage. Usually me. But now, there was nobody left, and reality hit him like a freight train. The first major blow came from the people he'd borrowed money from. For months, those people had been patient. They believed his promises, his excuses, his stories. Now the truth was public, and suddenly patience disappeared. One after another, they started demanding repayment. No more extensions, no more delays, no more sympathy, just payment. The irony was brutal. The same charm that had helped Jake avoid consequences for years no longer worked. Because trust, once broken, doesn't regenerate overnight. His friends stopped answering his calls. Several blocked him entirely. A few publicly confronted him. One guy even posted online about being owed money. Within days, Jake's social circle practically collapsed. People didn't just see him as irresponsible anymore. They saw him as dishonest. And that distinction mattered. A mistake can be forgiven. Betrayal is harder. Meanwhile, the financial pressure kept growing. The Mustang, the symbol of his victory, became a symbol of his disaster. At first, he tried keeping it. That lasted about 2 weeks. Then reality caught up. Insurance, payments, maintenance, fuel, everything cost money he didn't have. Eventually, he was forced to sell it. I still remember hearing about that, not because I felt happy. Because the image felt strangely symbolic. The car he'd proudly shown off just days after stealing the college fund was gone, almost as quickly as it had appeared. A temporary reward for a permanent mistake. Mom told me the sale barely covered part of what he owed. Most of the money had already disappeared through gambling losses. The rest had been spent recklessly. There was no hidden savings account, no secret reserve, no emergency fund. Just debt, a mountain of debt, and it kept growing. A month after the family meeting, I visited my parents again. The atmosphere in the house felt completely different. The tension wasn't directed at me anymore. It surrounded Jake. You could almost feel it in the walls. Mom looked exhausted. Dad looked older, not physically, emotionally. Like the last few months had drained years from him. At one point, Jake walked into the kitchen. The room instantly became awkward. Nobody knew what to say. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer because everyone was still adjusting to a new reality. The golden child wasn't golden anymore. He was simply human, flawed, selfish, capable of terrible decisions, just like anyone else. For years, my family had treated him like an exception. Now they were seeing him clearly for the first time, and Jake hated it. I could tell. He wasn't angry about losing the money. He wasn't angry about selling the car. He wasn't even angry about the debts. What bothered him most was losing the image, the identity, the role he'd occupied his entire life. The favorite, the trusted one, the son everyone admired. That version of Jake was gone, maybe forever. A few weeks later, Dad told me something surprising. Jake had asked him for help, financial help. The old version of my father would have said yes immediately, no questions asked. This time he refused. When Dad told me that, I almost didn't believe it. Not because I doubted him, because it represented such a dramatic change. For the first time, Jake was being required to solve his own problems. Dad explained it simply. He needs to understand what consequences feel like. Honestly, he was right. Painful lessons are still lessons, and Jake had avoided enough of them already. The hardest consequence wasn't financial, though. It was emotional. One evening about 2 months after the truth came out, Jake called me. I considered ignoring it. Eventually, curiosity won. I answered. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less confident, less certain. Hey, awkward silence, then another. Finally, he spoke. I owe you an apology. I stared out my apartment window. Part of me had imagined this conversation for months, maybe years. But now that it was happening, I didn't know what to feel. Jake continued. I was scared. I said nothing. I kept thinking I could fix everything before anyone found out. Another pause. When the money disappeared and everyone blamed you, his voice cracked. And for the first time since this entire nightmare started, I heard genuine shame. Not fear, not self-pity, shame. I should have told the truth. Yes, he should have. Immediately, instead, he'd watched my life burn. Watched family members abandon me. Watched my reputation get destroyed, and said nothing. The apology lasted nearly 20 minutes. By the end, I believed he meant it. The problem was that sincerity doesn't erase damage. Some wounds remain even after the person who caused them admits fault. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking, not about revenge, not about anger, about consequences, because karma isn't always dramatic. Sometimes nobody gets arrested, nobody gets publicly humiliated, nobody loses everything overnight. Sometimes karma is much simpler. Sometimes it's being forced to live with the truth about yourself. And that's exactly where Jake found himself. The lies were gone, the excuses were gone, the protection was gone. All that remained was reality, and reality was expensive. But while Jake was finally facing the consequences of his actions, something unexpected was happening on my side of the family. For the first time in years, my parents were trying to build a relationship with me that wasn't defined by comparison. No Jake versus Ethan, no favorite and backup, just family. The question was whether it was too late, and as the months passed, all of us would have to decide whether the damage done by one stolen college fund could ever truly be repaired. People love stories where karma arrives in a dramatic explosion, a public arrest, a courtroom confession, a spectacular downfall. For months, I thought that was what I wanted too. I imagined Jake being exposed. I imagined everyone apologizing. I imagined the family finally admitting I had been right all along. And eventually, all of those things happened. The strange part, when they finally did, it wasn't nearly as satisfying as I'd imagined. Because the real damage wasn't the missing money. It wasn't the gambling. It wasn't even the accusations. The real damage was discovering how quickly the people who loved me were willing to believe the worst about me. That wound didn't disappear when the truth came out, it stayed. Months passed after Jake's confession. Life slowly settled into a new routine. The constant family drama faded. The phone calls became less frequent, the arguments stopped. And for the first time in a long while, everybody was forced to live with the consequences of what had happened. Jake started attending counseling for gambling addiction. Dad made it clear that nobody was rescuing him financially. If he wanted to fix his life, he had to do it himself. For once, there would be no shortcuts, no special treatment, no golden child protection, just responsibility. Honestly, I think that ended up helping him more than anything, because for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to hide. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents remained complicated. Better, but complicated. Trust doesn't magically reappear because someone says sorry. Trust is built through consistency, through actions, through time, and time was exactly what we needed. One afternoon, about 6 months after the family meeting, Dad invited me to lunch, just the two of us. That had almost never happened growing up. Usually conversations involved Jake somehow. A comparison, a discussion, a competition neither of us had agreed to participate in. This time it was different. Halfway through lunch, Dad set down his coffee. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said something I never expected to hear. "You know, I spent years thinking I was being fair." I stayed quiet. I wasn't. The words seemed difficult for him, like admitting them cost something. "I kept expecting more from you because I knew you could handle it." I nodded slowly. That sounded exactly like something my parents would have believed. The problem was that it had never been fair. When one child is constantly expected to be strong, dependable, and responsible, eventually people stop noticing the weight they're carrying. Dad stared at the table. "I thought I was helping Jake." His voice became softer. "I didn't realize I was hurting both of you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said something I'd been carrying for years. "You never trusted me the way you trusted him." Dad closed his eyes because he knew it was true, and for once he didn't argue, he simply nodded. That conversation changed something between us. Not overnight, not completely, but enough. For the first time, it felt like we were being honest instead of pretending. A few weeks later, Mom invited me over for dinner again. At one point, she disappeared upstairs and returned carrying an old photo album. I laughed. "What is that?" She smiled. "Something I should have shown you years ago." Inside were hundreds of photographs, birthdays, school events, family vacations, little league games, graduations, the entire history of our family. As we flipped through the pages, Mom stopped at one particular photo. I was maybe 12 years old, standing beside Jake, both of us smiling. The picture looked normal, but Mom stared at it for a long time. Then she quietly said, "You spent so much time trying to be a good son." I felt a lump form in my throat. "You were." The tears started immediately, not because of the compliment, because it had taken 24 years to hear it, 24 years. Sometimes the things we need most aren't money, or success, or revenge. Sometimes it's simply being seen, and for the first time I felt seen, not compared, not measured against someone else, seen as myself. About a year after everything happened, the family gathered for Thanksgiving. The first major holiday since the disaster. I wasn't sure how it would go. Part of me expected awkwardness, part of me expected tension. Instead, something surprising happened. It felt normal, not perfect. Normal. Jake was there, quieter than he used to be, humbler, still rebuilding his life, still paying off debts, still working through the consequences of his choices, but trying. Actually trying. At one point during dinner, one of my relatives jokingly brought up old family stories. Normally, Jake would have been the center of attention, the favorite, the star. This time, nobody treated either of us that way. We were simply two adult sons sitting at a table. Equals, and honestly, that felt better than revenge ever could. Later that evening, as I helped Dad clean up dishes, he said something that stuck with me. You know what the worst part of all this was? What? He looked toward the dining room where everyone was laughing, thinking I almost lost the wrong son. For a second I couldn't speak, neither could he, because we both understood exactly what he meant. The stolen money had eventually been explained. The debts were being repaid. The gambling addiction was being treated. Those problems had solutions. The real tragedy would have been losing a relationship that never should have been damaged in the first place. As the night ended and everyone started heading home, I stood outside looking at the house. The same house where I'd been accused. The same house where my family had turned against me. The same house where the truth finally came out. A strange realization hit me. The real karma wasn't Jake losing the Mustang. It wasn't the debt. It wasn't the humiliation. The real karma was much simpler. Everyone was forced to confront the truth about themselves. Jake had to confront his lies. My parents had to confront their favoritism. My relatives had to confront their assumptions. And I had to confront my own anger. In the end, the stolen college fund wasn't what changed our family. The truth did. And while that truth hurt more than anything I'd ever experienced, it also gave us something we'd never had before. Honesty. For the first time in our lives, nobody was pretending. And that turned out to be worth far more than $80,000.